she was my best friend. Until I realized she was holding me back. I never thought I would find myself saying this, but sometimes the hardest part of letting go is realizing that the person you thought was your closest ally is actually the one holding you back. Her name was Mia, and for the longest time, I thought we were inseparable. We met in high school and we instantly clicked. We spent hours talking, sharing secrets, laughing over inside jokes. She was the one I called when I had a bad day or needed advice. She was the one who always had my back, or so I thought. We did everything together, going on spontaneous road trips, celebrating birthdays, comforting each other through heartbreaks, and supporting one another through life's challenges. I trusted her more than anyone, and I believed that our friendship was unbreakable. But over time, things began to change. At first, it was subtle. She started making little comments about the things I was doing, almost like she was undermining me without even realizing it. If I was proud of an accomplishment, she'd downplay it, brushing it off like it didn't matter. "It's not that big of a deal," she'd say with a shrug when I was excited about a new job or a promotion. Slowly, I started to feel small, like I wasn't allowed to feel good about myself when she was around. I started to notice other patterns too. How she would always make everything about herself. Every conversation seemed to be about her problems, her issues, her drama. When I tried to talk about something important to me, she would interrupt, change the subject, or offer unsolicited advice that didn't help. It wasn't just about being a good friend. It felt like she was more invested in her own narrative than in my well-being, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to face the fact that the person I had spent years of my life with might not be the person I thought she was. I made excuses for her, tried to justify her behavior. Maybe she was just going through something, I thought. Maybe she didn't realize what she was doing. I kept holding on to the hope that things would go back to the way they were. Then came the turning point. It happened one evening when I was struggling with something personal. I had just gotten some bad news, and I was feeling vulnerable. I reached out to Mia, hoping she would be there for me, the way I had always been there for her. But instead of offering the support I needed, she made it about her. She started talking about her own issues, completely ignoring what I was going through. It was like my pain didn't matter. That night, something inside me snapped. I realized that I had been investing so much energy into a friendship where I was never truly seen, never truly valued. I had spent so many years pouring my heart into a relationship with someone who wasn't willing to do the same for me. The realization was painful but necessary. I knew what I had to do, but it wasn't easy. Ending a friendship, especially one that had been so important to you, feels like a kind of loss. Like grieving a part of yourself. But I knew that staying in a friendship that was toxic was worse. It wasn't just draining me emotionally, it was holding me back from becoming the person I was meant to be. I distanced myself from Maya, little by little. At first, I felt guilty. I questioned whether I was being too harsh or whether I was overacting. But as time went on, I felt lighter. The constant weight of trying to keep up with her emotional needs, the endless validation she required, and the manipulation that had become so ingrained in our friendship started to fade away. I started to feel like myself again. I didn't confront Mia or have a dramatic falling out. Instead, I quietly withdrew. I stopped responding to her texts as frequently, stopped making plans. Eventually, she stopped reaching out altogether. It was painful, but it was the only way I could move forward. In the months that followed, I rediscovered a version of myself I hadn't realized I had lost. I started pursuing my passions, spending time with people who genuinely cared about me, and most importantly, I started putting myself first. I stopped feeling guilty for wanting to be happy and for prioritizing my own mental and emotional health. I had spent so long supporting someone else's dreams and problems that I had forgotten to care for my own. It wasn't until after the friendship ended that I fully understood the kind of person I had become. I had let someone else's negativity and self-centeredness overshadow my own joy. But by letting go, I had made space for healthier relationships, for friendships where mutual respect, love, and support were the foundation. Now, I'm in a better place. I have friends who genuinely listen when I speak, who celebrate my successes and comfort me during hard times. I've learned to trust myself again and set boundaries where I never thought I needed to. I know now that a friendship isn't meant to drain you. It's meant to lift you up, and if someone is doing the opposite, they don't deserve a place in your life. Maya's absence in my life was painful, but it was also necessary. I learned that sometimes, letting go of the people who aren't meant for you isn't a loss at all. It's a gain. And I'm finally learning to surround myself with those who bring out the best in me. I was always second place, until I learned to put myself first. Growing up, I was always the kind of person who loved to please others. I prided myself on being the friend who always showed up, the partner who always made sure their needs were met, and the daughter who did everything I could to make my parents proud. I was the one who would drop everything to be there for someone, even if it meant neglecting myself. And for the longest time, I thought that was how relationships worked. That if I just gave everything I had, people would love me more. But I learned the hard way that giving and giving without ever asking for anything in return doesn't always lead to the love you expect. It leads to exhaustion, resentment, and feeling like you're invisible. I met him when I was in college. He was everything I thought I wanted: charming, funny, and so incredibly attentive at first. We'd have long conversations, stay up late talking about our dreams, our favorite books, our favorite music. For a while, it felt like we were on the same wavelength, like we were connected in a way that no one else understood. I thought, this is it. This is the kind of love I've been waiting for. But over time, things started to change. It was subtle at first, small comments here and there that made me question myself. He would make jokes about how I was too much when I expressed my opinions, or how I cared too much when I showed concern for him. At first, I laughed it off. I thought it was just his sense of humor, that he didn't really mean it. But then it started to get worse. Whenever I tried to make plans with my friends, he would get upset, saying I was spending too much time away from him. He made me feel like I was abandoning him, even though I had never once ignored his needs. It wasn't long before I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells, always second-guessing myself, always prioritizing his feelings over my own. I remember one particular moment that opened my eyes. We were at a party, and I was having a good time with my friends, laughing, enjoying myself. But every time I tried to talk to him, he seemed distant, uninterested. He didn't want to dance with me, didn't want to join in on the conversations I was having. And then, in the middle of the party, he pulled me aside and said, "Why are you acting like you don't care about me? Why are you more interested in your friends than me?" Those words stung more than anything. I realized then that I was constantly chasing someone who didn't see me. I was always trying to prove myself worthy of love, trying to be the perfect girlfriend, trying to make him feel important. But no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. For a while, I stayed. I told myself that maybe it was just a rough patch, that maybe he just needed some time to figure things out. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't love. Love isn't supposed to make you feel invisible. It's not supposed to make you doubt yourself. I started to feel like I was losing who I was, like I had become a shadow of myself just to make him happy. That's when I finally reached my breaking point. I realized that I had been giving him so much of myself, so much of my time and energy, but I hadn't been giving any of that to me. I hadn't been taking care of my own needs, my own desires, my own happiness. I had been too focused on making him happy, on molding myself into what he wanted, that I had lost sight of who I really was. It took courage to walk away. It was hard because I didn't want to accept that I wasn't enough for him. I didn't want to admit that I had spent so much of my life in a relationship that was draining me instead of building me up. But I knew that I had to choose myself. I had to stop being second place in my own life. So, I ended it, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The silence in my mind wasn't filled with self-doubt and questions anymore. It was filled with clarity. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need to chase someone's approval. I needed to approve of myself first and foremost. After the breakup, it wasn't an immediate fix. I had to go through the process of rediscovering who I was outside of the relationship. I started doing things I loved again, taking long walks, reading, writing in my journal. I went back to hanging out with friends, spending time with people who appreciated me for who I was. I started to value myself more and took the time to invest in my personal growth. The more I focused on myself, the more I realized that I was worthy of so much more than I had been settling for. I didn't need to bend over backward for someone who didn't value me. I was enough just as I was. And when I started to truly believe that, my life changed. I attracted people who respected me, who loved me for who I was, not for who I pretended to be. In the end, walking away was the best decision I ever made. It was hard, it was painful, but it was worth it. I learned that the most important relationship I'll ever have is the one with myself. And once I started to nurture that, everything else started to fall into place. I almost lost myself in the pursuit of perfection. It's funny how we spend so much of our lives chasing this ideal version of ourselves, thinking that when we finally arrive, we'll feel complete. I used to be one of those people. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just perfected every area of my life, I'd find happiness. I thought success and perfection were the keys to feeling truly fulfilled. But as I look back now, I realized that I was so caught up in the chase that I almost lost the very essence of who I was. Growing up, I always had high standards for myself. My parents were supportive, but they were also driven. They encouraged me to aim high, to be the best at whatever I did. Whether it was academics, sports, or extracurricular activities, I was always striving to be number one. I was proud of my accomplishments, but somewhere along the way, the pride turned into pressure. In high school, I started pushing myself harder. I enrolled in advanced courses, joined every club I could, volunteered at every opportunity, and trained tirelessly for the sports I loved. I didn't want to be good, I wanted to be the best. I wanted to be the person everyone looked up to, the one who had it all together. But as I kept chasing perfection, something strange started happening. I felt empty. No matter how many awards I won, no matter how many compliments I received, it was never enough. The more I achieved, the more I felt like I was losing a piece of myself. I was so focused on meeting everyone else's expectations that I didn't know what I truly wanted anymore. I wasn't living my life for me, I was living it for the approval of others. The turning point came when I reached college. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I had been burning the candle at both ends, convinced that I had to keep proving myself. I had the perfect grades, the perfect internship, the perfect social circle. But I was miserable. I hadn't felt joy in anything I was doing for months. Every day felt like a grind, a race to reach the next goal, the next milestone. It wasn't until a close friend of mine sat me down one day that I realized how far I had fallen from the person I once was. She noticed that I had stopped smiling as much. She noticed that I was always stressed, always worried about the next task or responsibility. She said, "You used to love doing this stuff, but now it just seems like you're going through the motions." At first, I brushed it off. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd be fine once I got through the semester. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. I had gotten so used to running on autopilot, always striving, always competing, that I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I had turned into a version of myself that was focused solely on what I could do, not who I was. I spent the next few weeks reflecting on her words. I realized I had been chasing perfection for so long that I had stopped paying attention to what truly mattered to me. I had stopped asking myself, what makes me happy? And instead, I was always asking, what do I need to do next to keep impressing others? The more I reflected, the more I understood that perfection wasn't the key to happiness. Balance was. It wasn't about doing everything perfectly or being the best at everything. It was about doing what I loved, allowing myself space to rest, and accepting that it was okay to be imperfect. I started making small changes. I began saying no to commitments that didn't truly align with my passions. I started spending more time with people who made me feel at ease, not people who made me feel like I had to constantly prove myself. I made time for activities I once enjoyed but had neglected, like painting, hiking, and just taking long walks in nature to clear my head. I even started practicing mindfulness and meditation to reconnect with myself. It wasn't an easy transition, and there were days when I felt like I wasn't doing enough. But little by little, I began to feel more at peace with who I was. I realized that I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to constantly impress anyone. The people who truly cared about me didn't love me for my achievements. They loved me for who I was at my core. Today, I still aim for goals, but they're different now. I no longer measure my worth by what I accomplish. Instead, I measure it by how I feel, how I grow, and how I treat myself and others. I'm learning to accept that it's okay to fall short sometimes, to not have everything figured out, and to not be the best at everything. What matters now is that I'm living authentically, and that brings me a sense of fulfillment I never found in the pursuit of perfection. I've learned that perfection is a myth. Life isn't about being flawless, it's about being real. And that, I've found, is where the true beauty lies. He was my world until I realized I was my own. For a long time, he was everything to me. He wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my best friend, my confidant, the one person I thought would always have my back. From the very beginning, he seemed like he was tailor-made just for me. We had the same interests, the same quirky sense of humor, even the same favorite movies. I was convinced that I'd found my forever person. In the early days, things were perfect. He was attentive, thoughtful, and made me feel like the most important person in his life. He would bring me little gifts, just because, plan surprise dates, and listen intently whenever I talked about my dreams and fears. For the first time, I felt like someone truly understood me, like he saw every part of me and loved me for it. I let my guard down. I gave him my whole heart. But over time, things changed in ways I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first. He started making small comments about the way I dressed or the things I liked. "Are you really gonna wear that?" Or, "Why do you always have to talk about your job so much?" I brushed it off, thinking he was just giving honest feedback. But his words started cutting deeper, turning the things I once loved about myself into insecurities I didn't know I had. Soon, the little comments became bigger arguments. If I wanted to spend time with friends, he'd make me feel guilty, asking why I'd rather be with them than him. If I did something he didn't approve of, he'd give me the silent treatment for days, leaving me anxious and desperate to fix things. I began to feel like I was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move could trigger his anger or disappointment. I started losing myself in the process. I stopped going out with friends as much, stopped talking about my achievements or goals because I didn't want to brag around him. I even changed the way I dressed and the music I listened to because I thought it would make him happy. But no matter how much I changed, it was never enough. He still found things to criticize, still made me feel like I was somehow less than I should be. There was one night that changed everything. We had a huge fight, one of the worst we'd ever had. I don't even remember what started it, but I remember how it felt. His words were like knives, each one cutting into parts of me that I'd tried so hard to protect. I sat there listening to him tell me all the ways I wasn't good enough, all the ways I needed to be better, if I wanted this relationship to work. When he finally stormed out of the room, I sat there in silence, tears streaming down my face. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. I was a shadow of who I used to be. Someone who had given up her own happiness just to try to make someone else happy. That's when it hit me. I had forgotten how to be my own person. I had spent so much time trying to fit into his expectations, trying to be the person he wanted me to be, that I'd forgotten about what I wanted. I'd forgotten about my dreams, my passions, my own sense of self-worth. I realized that I had given him the power to define my value, and in doing so, I'd lost sight of my own. It was terrifying, but I knew what I had to do. The next day, I broke things off with him. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made because, for so long, he had been my world. But I knew that staying in that relationship meant losing myself even more, and I couldn't let that happen. I deserved to be with someone who loved me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. The weeks after the breakup were some of the loneliest and most challenging I'd ever faced. I had to confront all the insecurities he'd planted in my mind, all the doubts he'd made me feel about myself. I had to remind myself that I was enough, that I was worthy of love just as I was. I started journaling, going for long walks, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with. Slowly, I began to rebuild the parts of myself I'd lost. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that experience. It taught me the importance of setting boundaries, of not losing myself in someone else's expectations. I learned that love isn't about sacrificing your own happiness to make someone else happy. It's about finding someone who lifts you up, who supports you in being the best version of yourself. Today, I'm stronger and more confident than I've ever been. I know that my worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval, and I'll never allow someone to make me feel small again. I am my own person, and that is enough. Breaking free from my family's expectations. My family always had a plan for me. From the time I was little, my parents had this vision of who I would grow up to be: an ambitious, successful, and responsible daughter who would carry on the family legacy and make them proud. And for a long time, I wanted nothing more than to live up to that. I was a good student, always focused and disciplined. I never gave my parents a reason to worry, never rebelled, and always did what was expected. But as I grew older, especially into my late teens and early 20s, I began to feel this weight on my shoulders. It was like every choice I made, every step I took, was always under a microscope. My life felt like it wasn't really mine. When I was in college, I started to discover my own passions. I loved art, especially digital design, and I dreamed of turning it into a career. But my parents had a very different idea. They wanted me to go into something stable, something they thought would give me a secure future. Medicine or law, something they could proudly tell their friends about. I remember the first time I brought up my interest in pursuing a career in art. My parents were stunned, and not in a good way. They asked if I was joking. My father said, "We didn't work this hard just for you to throw your life away on something so impractical." The conversation ended with me feeling guilty, ashamed, and even foolish for wanting something so unrealistic. For the next couple of years, I tried to push my dreams aside. I went along with what my family wanted, choosing a major that aligned with their expectations. But every day, I felt a part of me slipping away. I was doing well academically, but I felt hollow. I was living a life that didn't feel like mine, constantly trying to please my family and meet their expectations, even if it meant burying my own desires. One day, I was in a class that I found absolutely draining, and I realized that I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't spend the rest of my life in a career that made me miserable just to make someone else happy. I wanted to be true to myself, to create a life that felt meaningful and fulfilling. I knew that if I kept down this path, I would end up resenting not only my career but also my family. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I started taking small steps toward my dream. I joined a few art clubs on campus, entered a couple of design competitions, and even took on a freelance project to build my portfolio. Every time I thought about telling my parents, fear would wash over me. I knew they would be disappointed, and that thought was heartbreaking, but I also knew I couldn't keep living a lie. Finally, I gathered the courage to sit down with them. I had prepared for the worst. Anger, disappointment, maybe even silence. I explained to them that art and design were what made me feel alive, what gave me a sense of purpose. I told them that I respected their dreams for me, but I needed to follow my own path, that I had to live for myself. The conversation didn't go well. There were tears, frustration, and a lot of things left unsaid. For a while, my parents didn't fully understand. They thought I was being naive, that I was throwing away a stable future for something fleeting. But for the first time in my life, I stood firm. I told them that I appreciated everything they had done for me, but I had to be true to myself. Over time, things slowly improved. My parents began to see how passionate I was about my work and that I was genuinely committed to building a career in design. They might not have fully understood my choice, but they started to respect it. And as I kept growing in my field, finding success in ways that felt authentic to me, they began to see that I was, in fact, creating a secure future, just not in the way they had envisioned. Today, I'm proud to say I'm a full-time digital designer, and I've even started my own small business. I'm doing what I love every day, and I finally feel like I'm living a life that's truly mine. My relationship with my parents is much stronger now. They may not have understood my choices at first, but they eventually saw the happiness and fulfillment that came from living authentically.